Chairman, Dr. Rice, you've given us a very strong statement with regard to the actions taken by the administration in this pre-9/11 period, and we appreciate that very much for the record. I want to call to your attention some comments and some events on the other side of that question and give you an opportunity to respond. You know very well that the Commission is focusing on this whole question of what priority did the Clinton administration and the Bush administration give to terrorism. The President told Bob Woodward that he did not feel that sense of urgency. I think that's a quote from his book, or roughly a quote from Woodward's book. The Deputy Director for Central Intelligence, Mr. McLaughlin, told us that he was concerned about the pace of policymaking in the summer of 2001, given the urgency of the threat. The Deputy Secretary of State, Mr. Armitage, was here and expressed his concerns about the speed of the process. And if I recall his comment, it is, we weren't going fast enough. I think that's a direct quote. There was no response to the Cole attack in the Clinton administration and none in the Bush administration. Your public statements focused largely on China and Russia and missile defense. You did make comments on terrorism, but they were connected, the link between terrorism and the rogue regimes like North Korea and Iran and Iraq. And by our count here, there were some 100 meetings by the national security principals before the first meeting was held on terrorism, September 4th. And General Shelton, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said that terrorism had been pushed farther to the back burner. Now, this is what we're trying to assess. We have your statements, we have these other statements, and I know, as I indicated in my opening comments, how difficult the role of the policymaker is and how many things press upon you. But I did want to give you an opportunity to comment on some of these other matters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin with the Woodward quote, because that has gotten a lot of press, and I actually think that the quote put in context gives a very different picture. The question that the President was asked by Mr. Woodward was, did you want to have bin Laden killed before September 11th? That was the question. The President said, well, I hadn't seen a plan to do that. I knew that we needed to, I think the appropriate word is bring him to justice. And of course, this is something of a trick question in that notion of self-defense, which is appropriate for, I think you can see here, a President struggling with whether he ought to be talking about pre-9/11 attempts to kill bin Laden. And so that is the context for this quote. And quite frankly, I remember the director sitting here and saying he didn't want to talk about authorities on assassination. I think you can understand the discomfort of the President. The President goes on when Bob Woodward says, well, I don't mean it as a trick question. I'm just trying to get your state of mind. The President says, let me put it this way. There was a significant difference in my attitude after September 11th. I was not on point, but I knew he was a menace and I knew he was a problem. I knew he was responsible. We felt he was responsible for bombings that had killed Americans, and I was prepared to look at a plan that would be a thoughtful plan that would bring him to justice and would have given the order to do just that. I have no hesitancy about going after him, but I didn't feel that sense of urgency, and my blood was not nearly as boiling. Whose blood was nearly as boiling prior to September 11th? And I think the context helps here. It is also the case that the President had been told by the Director of Central Intelligence that it was not going to be a silver bullet to kill bin Laden, that you had to do much more. And in fact, I think that some of us felt that the so much focus on what you did with bin Laden, not what you did with the network, not what you did with the regional circumstances, might in fact have been misplaced. So I think the President is responding to a specific set of questions. All that I can tell you is that what the President wanted was a plan to eliminate al-Qaeda so he could stop swatting at flies. He knew that we had in place the same crisis management mechanism, indeed the same personnel, that the Clinton administration, which clearly thought it a very high priority, had in place. And so I think that he saw the priority as continuing the current operations and then getting a plan in place. Now, as to the number of PCs, I'm sorry, there's some difference in our records here. We show 33 Principals Committee meetings during this period of time, not 100. We show that 3 of those dealt with issues, at least partially with issues dealing with terrorism not related to Al-Qaeda. And so we can check the numbers, but we have looked at our files and we show 33, not 100. The quotes by others about how the process was moving. Again, it's important to realize that we had parallel tracks here. We were continuing to do what the Clinton administration had been doing under all the same authorities that were operating. George Tenet was continuing to try to disrupt Al-Qaeda. We were continuing the diplomatic efforts. But we did want to take the time to get in place a policy that was more strategic toward Al-Qaeda, more robust. It takes some time to think about how to reorient your policy toward Pakistan. It takes some time to think about how to have a more effective policy toward Afghanistan. It particularly takes some time when you don't get your people on board for several months. So I understand that there are those who have said they felt it wasn't moving along fast enough. I talk to George Tenet about this at least every couple of weeks, sometimes more often. How can we move forward on the Predator? What do you want to do about the Northern Alliance? So I think we were putting the energy into it. And I should just make one other point, Mr. Hamilton, if you don't mind, which is that we also moved forward on some of the specific ideas that Dick Clark had put forward prior to completing the strategy review. We increased assistance to Uzbekistan, for instance, which had been one of the recommendations. We moved along the armed predator, the development of the armed predator. We increased counterterrorism funding. But there were a couple of things that we did not want to do. I'm now convinced that while nothing that in this strategy would have done anything about 9/11, if we had in fact moved on the things that were in the original memos that we got from our counterterrorism people, we might have even gone off course because it was very Northern Alliance focused. That was going to cause a huge problem with Pakistan. It was not going to put us in the center of action in Afghanistan, which is the South. And so we simply had to take some time to get this right. But I think we need not confuse that with either what we did during the threat period, where we were urgently working the operational issues every day, or with the continuation of the Clinton policy.
Well, I thank you for a careful answer. Another question. At the end of the day, of course, we were unable to protect our people. And you suggest in your statement, and I want you to elaborate on this if you want to, that in hindsight it would have been better information about the threats, would have been the single most important thing for us to have done from your point of view prior to 9/11 would have been better intelligence, better information about the threats. Is that right? Are there other things that you think stand out?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I took an oath of office on the day that I took this job to protect and defend. And like most government officials, I took it very seriously. And so as you might imagine, I've asked myself 1,000 times what more we could have done. I know that had we thought that there was an attack coming in Washington or New York, we would have moved heaven and earth to try and stop it. And I know that there was no single thing that might have prevented that attack. In looking back, I believe that the absence of light, so to speak, on what was going on inside the country, the inability to connect the dots, was really structural. We couldn't be dependent on chance that something might come together. And the legal impediments and the bureaucratic impediments, but I want to emphasize the legal impediments, to keep the FBI and the CIA from functioning really as one so that there was no seam between domestic and foreign intelligence was probably the greatest one. The Director of Central Intelligence and I think Director Free had an excellent relationship. They were trying hard to bridge that seam. I know that Louis Free had developed legal attachés abroad to try to help bridge that. But when it came right down to it, this country, for reasons of history and culture and therefore law, had an allergy to the notion of domestic intelligence, and we were organized on that basis, and it just made it very hard to have all of the pieces come together. We've made good changes since then. I think that having a Homeland Security Department that can bring together the FAA and the INS and Customs and all of the various agencies is a very important step. I think that the creation of the Terrorism Threat Information Center, which brings together all of the intelligence from various aspects, is a very important step forward. Clearly, the Patriot Act, which has allowed the kind of sharing, indeed demands the kind of sharing between intelligence agencies, including the FBI and the CIA, is a very big step forward. I think one thing that we will learn from you is whether the structural work is done.
Final question would be, one of your sentences kind of jumped out at me in your statement, and that was on page 9, where you said, we must address the source of the problem. I'm very concerned about that. I was pleased to see it in your statement. And I'm very worried about the threat of terrorism, as I know you are, over a very long period of time, a generation or more. There are a lot of very, very fine, 2 billion Muslims. Most of them we know are very fine people. Some don't like us, they hate us. They don't like what modernization does to their culture. They don't like the fact that economic prosperity has passed them by. They don't like some of the policies of the United States government. They don't like the way their own governments treat them. And I'd like you to elaborate a little bit, if you would, on how we get at the source of the problem. How do we get at this discontent, this dislocation, if you would, across a big swath of the Islamic world?
I believe very strongly, and the President believes very strongly, that this is really the generational challenge. The kinds of issues that you are addressing have to be addressed, but we're not going to see success on our watch. We will see some small victories on our watch. One of the most difficult problems in the Middle East is that the United States has been associated for a long time, decades, with a policy that looks the other way on the freedom deficit in the Middle East, that looks the other way at the absence of individual liberties in the Middle East. And I think that that has tended to alienate us from the populations of the Middle East. And when the President at Whitehall in London said that that was no longer going to be the stance of the United States, we were expecting more from our friends. We were going to try and engage those in those countries who wanted to have a different kind of Middle East. I believe that he was resonating with trends that are there in the Middle East. There are reformist trends in places like Bahrain and Jordan. And recently there was a marvelous conference in Alexandria in Egypt where reform was actually on the agenda. So it's going to be a slow process. We know that the building of democracy is tough. It doesn't come easily. We have our own history. You know, when our founding fathers said we the people, they didn't mean me. It's taken us a while to get to a multi-ethnic democracy that works. But if America is avowedly values-centered in its foreign policy, we do better than when we do not stand up for those values. So I think that it's going to be very hard. It's going to take time. One of the things that we've been very interested, for instance, in is issues of educational reform in some of these countries. As you know, the madrasas are a big difficulty. I've met myself personally 2 or 3 times with the Pakistani, wonderful woman who's the Pakistani education minister. We can't do it for them. They have to do it for themselves, but we have to stand for those values. And over the long run, we will change, I believe we will change the nature of the Middle East, particularly if there are examples that this can work in the Middle East. And this is why Iraq is so important. The Iraqi people are struggling to find a way to create a multi-ethnic democracy that works. And it's going to be hard. And if we stay with them, and when they succeed, I think we will have made a big change. They will have made a big change in the middle of the Arab world, and we will be on our way to addressing the source.